we are shocked and saddened by the terrible story from the school in Texas this past week. Unfortunately, this devastating news is not unique in our times. Whether it be other school shootings, Rahman al-Islam, whether it be the terrible difficulties going on in Ukraine, whether it be difficulties in Israel, whether it be anti-Semitic attacks around the world, it's very easy to become numb to all of the news. In a sense, the fact that news is so widely reported and so frequently reported, on the one hand, puts us in touch with all the problems around the world. And on the other hand, we develop this little box within our hearts and minds of terribly unfortunate news. We think about it for a few moments, and then we put it in the box because we're used to it, because we hear a lot of it, unfortunately. It doesn't matter. As human beings, as compassionate human beings, it is imperative for us to stop and think, and most importantly, feel when such a terrible tragedy occurs, when any terrible tragedy occurs. Having said that, I think it's not difficult to connect to the emotional pain whenever schools and particularly young children are involved. And maybe there's a small benefit or value in trying to understand ourselves a little bit better as to why we're so uniquely touched by a senseless attack against children. Obviously, one of the reasons why leads to a theological question, which is so beyond our scope of understanding. But how could such a thing happen in the first place? What could these children have done? And they're just innocent kids. And what do you want from them? And of course, we're not only mourning the loss of the children, but the teachers and the families of all of these people, young or older. But that's clearly part of it. Clearly part of it is they're so innocent. How could such a thing happen? But I think there's something else. The Sfas Emes says on the opening phrase of this week's Parsha, in Bechukosai telechu, if you walk with my laws. And we're used to the phrase, but when you think about it, what does it even mean to walk with God's laws? The next phrase in the pasuk talks about ushmartem, observing God's commandments. I get that. What does it mean to walk with God's laws? And the Sfas Emes says a very interesting thing. The Sfas Emes says that we physically develop in life. A child grows, becomes taller, becomes stronger. The same thing has to be true for our spiritual development, for people of all ages. And the idea is that the way we connect to God's laws is as holchim, people constantly growing. I think if we just borrow that concept for a moment, I think that helps us understand deeper why we're so hurt and pained when something terrible happens to children. And that is that the way of the world is that the child in front of us today it is a developed, enhanced human being tomorrow, and certainly years and years down the road. So we look at children and we see remarkable potential. And we know that all of us are supposed to be growing and developing, but it's hard to grow and develop. But children do it so naturally. The idea that those small human beings that had such a path in front of them and it will never be actualized is utterly tragic. And maybe, perhaps that's part of our emotional connection to the death of children, perhaps. And if indeed that is part of our emotional connection to the death of children, presumably it behooves us to try to channel that in some way, to try to learn from that about ourselves and channel it in a positive way when we view our children or our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren or our friends' children, to try to see them not only as people, not only as cute and sweet, etc., but to try to see them as the future, to try to see them as people of remarkable potential, particularly when it's our own children, to try to not only react and discipline in the present, but to try to think about what does this mean for the future of the child? Is this a big deal in the big picture? If it's not a big deal in the big picture, maybe it doesn't make sense for me to be so agitated. If it is a big deal in the big picture, maybe it doesn't make sense for me to be so lazy about it, and so on and so forth. But just to sum up, we must feel the human tragedy of such a terrible story. Item number one. Item number two, to just reflect a little bit that part of why we connect so much to stories about children, tragedies about children, is because we innately believe in the remarkable potential of children. And we have to remember in our own lives, in our own raising of children, how much potential is there and how much we shouldn't get stuck in the present and how much we have to look forward to the future. And finally, just to state the obvious, such terrible stories remind each and every one of us who have the remarkable good fortune to have a child, to have a grandchild, to have a great-grandchild, how much of a blessing it is in our lives. And let us not forget every single day of our lives how fortunate we are. And forgive the cliche, but maybe when we hear such a story, we should feel compelled to just give our children an extra hug and maybe be a little bit more forgiving of whatever shortcomings of the moment our children might have. May the people in Texas have much strength and comfort, and may HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring us the ultimate redemption so we don't have to read any such terrible stories anymore speedily in our days. Have a good Shabbos.